All right, we are starting tonight with the review of chapter 13 when all of our groups get back. You've been done early. Did you leave at your 60-second warning? Oh, you're on mute still, Dee Dee.
Yeah, we got the warning. You have 30 seconds left, so
All right,
we'll just come back out. See, there they are.
here they go. What I should have done was turn
Recording.
Okay, that must be everybody. So everybody. All right, so I didn't number your groups either, so we'll just let's see. I think the first row in front of me was probably one group. Laura, Cheryl, and Dee Dee, were you all one group? So why don't we start with you? Why don't you tell us what your segment themes were? What did you have for verses 1 to 6?
The idols will remove, the false prophets punished, and will stop prophesying.
Okay.
And then the last 7 through 9 was a little more challenging because it's just, we felt it was all important. So here we go. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. The surviving 1/3 will call God's name.
Okay, good. Anybody from any of the other two groups, would you add or change, or did you focus on anything different for that? Because Dee Dee's right, for sure the second half is only 3 verses long, but there's a lot in it, so. Everybody's happy with those?
Say it again. Say it again, Dee Dee, please.
Oh,
Oops. Okay, there we go. Strike the shepherd and scatter the sheep. The surviving 1/3 will call God's name.
Okay.
okay. So let's see, Tracy, whoever was in Tracy's group, why don't you start by telling us then what you focused on next? Like, how would you summarize the chapter, or did you focus on verses 7 to 9? Why don't the people in Tracy's group tell us what they did next?
We kind of got some of the same segment themes that Dee Dee just gave. I kind of looked at the fountain in verse 1 because it's going to be open for the house of David and for the sin of and for their sin and their impurity. Mm-hmm. I kind of looked at that as like maybe that was like the blood of Jesus is the fountain that cleanses us from sin and impurity. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so beyond the segment themes, what did you guys focus on after that?
I know Lisa had a question about the third part and why the first and the second part were cut off. And so we discussed that was because they were probably the ones that were disobedient with their sin and impurity, and the third part were those who are still seeking God and following and being obedient.
Okay. All right. Any of the last group, or I had 2 more groups, I guess. Who's next? So Janelle. Anybody in Janelle's group, what would you add to what you're taking away from chapter 13?
Well, like in verse 7, we talked about the shepherd and who is my associate. Mm-hmm. And we kind of thought probably the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
Was my associate. And then, yeah, we talked about that's exactly what happened, was strike the shepherd that the sheep may be scattered. When Jesus was taken, it wasn't long before there was persecution, and the disciples split up and went to different areas, geographic areas, to spread the word.
Okay. And is that something that Jesus knew about?
Yes, he had to have known.
Yes. So you had, this is where you might have discussed one of your cross references, Matthew 26, where Jesus quotes this passage from Zechariah. And he says that because of this prophecy, what were they all going to do?
All away.
Fall away. You will all fall away because they're going to strike the shepherd. So we know then that verse 7 refers to prophecy of Jesus's first coming. What do you think happens in verses 8 and 9? Anybody from any of the groups?
I thought it was maybe a reference to when the second coming and the fighting in Jerusalem were part of the city, and I don't remember if it was a 2/3, but where a lot of the city is destroyed, and then the Lord comes in and fights and saves them. But some commentaries had other ideas.
Yeah,
But my first thought was that it was a future prophecy.
right. And I'm sure there were probably some that would have different interpretations, because there's very little scripturally that doesn't have a variety. Oddly enough, there's almost no scripture that doesn't have a wide variety of or at least some differing opinions. And now there's lots of opinions. Okay. In summary, what they wanted to know was how you were looking at that third, that we have that question about, and what will they say eventually, this third? First of all, even though there is a remnant, what do we know is going to happen to them according to Zechariah 13, 8 and 9? Does saved mean easy? Go ahead, Fran, sorry.
No, well, it said only a third will survive the tribulation. It's difficult. It's not, I think was that in 14 even? It talks about how it's not easy.
It isn't, but even in verse 9, what does he call what will happen to them?
Oh, refined. They're going to be
Refined by fire,
Fire.
right? So in a very simple way, if we didn't even want to go into commentary or any different weeds than others that we could find, the difference between the 2/3 and a third are those who can go through the fire. They all probably go through the fire, and only a third of them are refined through it. So either they do what Jesus pictures when he's struck, right? They fall away. That's sort of a picture, right, of being refined by fire, right? Your leader is taken in, arrested, is going to be killed, and you are afraid and you run instead of sticking, right? Could we call that a trial by fire? Were the disciples tried? They were tried. That's why they could write about it the way that they did. Peter and Paul could both, and John could all, and Jane, all of them could all write very firsthand experience or what it means to have gone through that and to a certain degree failed, but come back around. So everything we look at, we can look at the picture and then look at what happened to Israel, but we can always also take it to how did that apply as well to the disciples. So we see that, we know that time frame. And so Fran called this time the tribulation. And so some of us would have already looked at that, because again, working backwards, when we studied Revelation, finished studying Revelation 4 years ago, we were in this passage as well, because we were looking backwards at this remnant that survives the tribulation. And so we're putting all those pieces together from chapter 12, that they will see him who they pierced and they will mourn. They're saved because of that. That getting to that point is going to be trial by fire. And then they will become his people. So the question that I think they really wanted you to see was, we see this in Zechariah, and we went to several Old Testament references to tie in Jesus with new covenant, this new picture of what is going to happen. But also they gave us Romans 11, 25 to 27. What did we learn there, and how does that tie in to Zechariah chapter 13? It's Romans 11, verses 25 to 27.
I have in my notes, and I'm like, I kept to go back and look at the scripture again, but the partial hardening has happened to Israel until the Gentiles come in.
Mhm.
Okay.
And then,
Go ahead.
and then it said all Israel will be saved. And that's where I'm confused, because it's a third, only a third, right? Not all.
So the third that's left, is that all of them?
Is it?
Is it? If they're a remnant, is that all of them?
It's a portion of them. A remnant to me is not everybody makes it.
What happened to the 2/3?
Gone.
They perished.
They're gone.
Yeah.
So the third
Oh,
that's
so
left
the third that's left is all that's left.
is all, right?
Got
Yes.
it.
So at any other point, could we say Romans 11 would have happened then? Because has the entire nation of Israel ever recognized Jesus and made covenant with him? No. So we know that where we can put this time frame. It lines right up because of that, right? That there's only going to be one time when that remnant that goes through the fire is saved. They will be the ones who do what we talked about in chapter 12. They will see him who they pierced. They will recognize who it is, and they will mourn him and then bow down and confess him as Lord, as will everyone else who survives that, right? Good. The thing we want to clear up there is that this is the other tie-in. When you look at what Romans says, the partial hardening of Israel is what we would see now. From that time on, right? They didn't all recognize, want to accept Jesus, right? Especially the leadership, which of course trickled down. So they didn't. So some of them, their hearts were hardened, and their hearts, some of them have remained hardened towards Jesus, not towards God necessarily, although many of them have walked away from their faith completely, but not all. There are Orthodox Jews who still represent that cult, that spiritual body. But as a whole, anyone who's still not a Messianic Jew is still got their hearts hardened toward Jesus. It says that a partial hardening, meaning some of them, has happened until what about the Gentiles? We want to make sure we get all this. Until what, Deanna?
The full number of Gentiles has come in.
Right, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And this can help you then tie in that question that maybe some of us are asking right now. Why on earth are we still here, God? Why are we still here? Well, we are still here because apparently we still have some impact or ability until every Gentile who will be saved is saved. That's besides Israel being his time clock, that's the other ticker we can see right here, right? There's a number and there's a day when God says, that's it. Those are all that are going to come. And we watched the hearts of those who remain, right? When you read Revelation, that repeated verse is, and their hearts were hardened and they blasphemed God. Everything he did to try to win them over. Instead, those who dwell on the earth blaspheme him and reject him. So we're watching for that number. So once that happens, the stuff for Israel is also going to change, and it's all going to work together in this amazing thing, right? The Gentile picture changes, and then Israel's going to change. A lot of things are going to happen to Israel in the meantime, and those are the things that we're watching for. So does that help when you look at Romans? So that's what he's saying there. And then you can see that he's quoting the Old Testament. And this is, so all Israel will be saved. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove the ungodliness from them and take away their sins. Does that sound like what we just read in Zechariah 12? Yeah. So we can definitely tie Romans 11 into that idea that on a day, God is going to clean them. And then tying it into the other Old Testament verses you guys looked at in Ezekiel and Jeremiah, in Romans, he also says, this is my covenant with them, right? That he's going to take away their sins. And you can kind of tie them all together time frame wise with those, right? Other thoughts or questions overall about all of those moving parts in Zechariah 13?
I got, in our small group got, well, I led them to down the more of the focus on the prophets.
Okay.
'Cause I still am confused by why that was put in there, other than as a warning against, for those that are trying to discern how to navigate through this period, to be aware as a warning for those false prophets.
Yeah,
But
I think so. And Jeremiah 23 is the Old Testament reference that would have given you exactly what you just said, Fran, right? As you guys looked at your Old Testament, he warned them against false prophets, against those. And that's where you get a really clear indication of when God and why he says there's no longer any need. Did anybody note that? I'm sorry, I don't have your page numbers for you on these cross references. What he said in Jeremiah 23 about what the false prophets did and didn't do.
that's on page 74.
Okay, thank you.
Said, I am against the prophets who steal my words from each other. I'm against the prophets who use their tongues and declare the Lord declares. I'm against those who prophesied false dreams and related them and led my people astray.
Yeah, there's another line that will help you.
Oh,
You have it in that they report that they say declares the Lord, but what's the key?
He does not send them or command them.
He didn't send or command them. So false prophets are those who speak, and it didn't just happen at this end time when he says in Zechariah 13 that there won't be a need for them anymore. So how did we kind of sum that up last week? What is God saying in verses 1-6 about this time where he's going to remove sin, idols, and prophets? Why is he removing them?
He's cleansing, bringing out the impurities.
He's cleansing. So anyone that was impure, what's the other very sort of just logical reason why there will no longer be prophets at this time he's talking about?
Will be needed
Why won't it be needed, Tracy?
because Jesus will be here.
It's going to be a time where all the prophecies will be fulfilled. So that will help you tie Zechariah 13 verses 1-6 in that day, which is what we're looking at, right? In that day, everything we're looking at in chapter 12, 13, and 14, that day and through that rest of that period, every prophecy about Jesus will be fulfilled. And anyone who's still prophesying or saying anything else would just be false. And so there's no need for them. Does that make sense? And so, but just like in Peter and another thing, all through the Old Testament, God was giving them warnings about false prophets, false leaders, false teachers, false shepherds, all of that. But we see that picture in Jeremiah 23. Good. What else can we answer or talk about from 13? Okay, well, let's say, what would you put then as chapter theme? Or what did you put? Let's just go ahead and do it because we won't have a next discussion to ask you, I guess.
I like my chapter seems to be positive, so I said they are my people.
Okay, good. That will happen. Good.
The third, 1/3 left will be the Lord's people.
Okay, good. There'll be a remnant, right? This is something are they used to being a people who are a remnant, by the way? These people that he's talking to in Zechariah, they are a remnant already, right? So this is positive to them, especially because they don't know, as the prophet shares with them, what time frame God's talking about. They just know he's going to save a remnant. Now, they also know the remnant's going to walk through fire, but are they a people that are used to that as well? Yeah,
They're used to trial. Yeah.
that's right. They're used to it and they're pretty much living it at the moment that Zechariah is speaking to them. Okay, well, as much as we could spend a whole nother hour talking about 13, let's go ahead and move on to 14. And we're not going to read the whole thing at once because, again, I want us to move through it. Normally, we would read it, the whole thing as context, but we're just going to read it and discuss it in the segments that we've been talking about. So we're going to combine a few of the segments because, as you might have noticed, that is not a misprint. There were a lot of there was a whole chunk of one verse segments because they all had their own ideas. But if I could get, let's see, Sarah, would you mind reading for us? Can you read? Would you read verses 1-5 of Zechariah 14 for us?
Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half of the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as well when he fights on a day of battle. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half of the mountain will move towards the north and the other half toward the south. You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azel. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him.
Okay. So again, a mix for them to hear. I forgot to warn you in advance to be looking at the things that were going to stand out to you. And I feel like even this segment, for our purposes, really kind of breaks itself into verses 1-3 and verses 4-6. So we are definitely going to first look at 1-3 when you just either look at what you have marked or remember what you just listened to. What stands out to you? What word or idea stands out to you from verses 1-3?
Battle.
Battle, right? We heard it several times, fighting and battling. And if we look at Zechariah 14, 1-3, and you compare it to 12, this is on your day 5 homework, I guess it would be, yeah. The very beginning of that. What's the comparison between what you would have read in Zechariah chapter 12 in its beginning verses compared to verses 1-3 here?
Well, the first part's very similar, I thought, but then in chapter 14, we have the added concept of the Lord going forth and fighting against the nations as when he fights on the day of battle.
Okay, good. So we saw this picture of gathering for a battle in 12, and now we have that added picture that the Lord is fighting, but also how did the nations come to be gathered against Jerusalem?
So that I will gather them, so the
God will
Lord gathered them.
God gathers them for this battle and then he fights the battle. Just those two ideas alone, what does that indicate to you about God's purposes?
Well, Israel are his chosen people, and he's protecting and defending until they turn away, and then
Okay.
they
And
get
here, he's ready to do what he promises to anyone who comes against Jerusalem. So in chapter 12, what did he say? We had two pictures of what he would make Jerusalem to anyone that comes against them.
A cup of reeling and a strong stone.
Okay, a cup of reeling and a stone heavy that it would injure anyone who tried to move it. What did it say the cup of reeling would cause? Something to the horses and something then to the riders.
Plague, madness, and bewilderment.
Yeah, the riders would have madness come upon them. Do you see that idea in Zechariah 14? Maybe later. We may not get to it till later. Yeah, so we'll talk about it when we get further. Right now, we just see the Lord going forth to fight the battle. So it's interesting, right? I ask, if God gathers people to fight them, then his purpose must be to have that battle, right? To fight them. That's, if you were to go to groups of people, imagine your children, and gather them together in order for them to have a battle, then you would have some certain purpose in wanting to see people fight. Or if you gathered people together to fight against someone, but then you came and did the fighting for them, it would indicate to me that you were the one who really wanted the victory. You wanted to have that battle against those people, even though you called them against another. So we see God taking this action that he has promised to have. Let's go ahead and talk about the next part before we go into the details through some cross references about that battle, because we have a setting here for these verses. What is that setting? Verses 1 through 5.
In that day, or day is coming.
Okay, the day is the time. Yep. So we know the time frame in that day that we've been talking about.
Mount of Olives.
Okay, on the Mount of Olives. So we have Jerusalem, but where this battle is going to happen, but then we have a very specific part focused on, which is the Mount of Olives. So what's going to happen on the Mount of Olives, just according to Zechariah 14?
The Lord is going to stand and it's going to be split.
Okay, he's going to stand where, Tracy?
On the Mount of Olives.
Okay, good. On the mountain, and it's going to split. How's it going to split?
East to west.
In the
East to
middle,
west. And what does that make?
a valley.
It makes a valley. And I never looked at these verses this way till they asked us to look and see what is the purpose of Jesus splitting the mountain and making a valley. I've always just thought, wow, that's really cool. But now I see, oh, there is actually a purpose for it.
So the people can flee.
So the people can flee, right? We're looking at people that are going to be saved. He has just made their way. Instead of having to go through mountain, they're going to flee through this valley. Good. Then what will happen? So we have some action. We have a series of actions, right? There's a battle. Jesus is going to stand on the Mount of Olives. It's going to split. People can flee. And then what's the then?
The Lord my God will come and all the
And
holy ones with him.
all his holy ones with him, right? Great verses here. So now let's go ahead and look at what you had for battle cross references. these were verses that a good sized group of you have had before to discuss this battle. In fact, we did it from the opposite way. We studied it in Revelation, and then we probably were in Zechariah and Joel. Not probably, I know that we were. So if we were to look at, in one grouping, they gave you Revelation 15:1, verses 7 to 8 then, and then in chapter 16, verses 12 to 16. So let's take down what you got from that. Anybody want to give us some of the details they picked up from those passages?
Well, we have the 7 angels with the 7 plagues that are the wrath of God. Well, when
Okay.
the wrath of God is finished, when the 7 plagues are finished.
Okay, good. So they gave us just that one verse to show us and remind us where we are in everything that's happening in the tribulation and what this battle is part of. Good. That was just sort of like a little background. And then they jumped to, I think that pretty much gives us that. Then we go into chapter 16, verses 12 to 16, and we get some of the details of what this looks like. What did you learn there?
The 6th angel poured out the bowl on the Euphrates River, and it dried up. So the way was prepared for the kings from the east.
Okay.
And then, 3 spirits, I can't read my writing, sorry, were performing signs to gather the kings of the whole world for war to go, for the war of the great day, or the great day of the God.
Okay, so now we see this, how the way is going to be made for these nations to come and to gather against Jerusalem. The great river that's in the way is dried up, and we see it's called the Great War, or the War of the Great Day of the God Almighty. And then we're given a place name. And what was that?
Armageddon.
Armageddon. And so we end up hearing of that as if it's the title of a battle. Is it the title of the battle? What is it actually?
It's a place.
It's the place.
The
It's
valley, the place.
It's that place. And if you look scripturally, a lot of battles happened at this place. It's been very significant scripturally. We didn't go to all those places, but you easily could by cross-referencing back or using a concordance and just putting in Har and Megiddo, and then you would find it. Okay, so we have a setting and how it's going to happen, and we see this time frame lining up with what we thought it would. What else did you learn if you go to the next chapter of Revelation 17, verse 14?
The Lamb will overcome them, all the
Okay.
enemies.
Yes, it said there was a list in the verse before they gave you of these kings coming against Jerusalem, and it says the Lamb will overcome them. How come?
He is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings.
Yep. We had another connection in this one tiny little verse back to Zechariah 14. What's the other thing you might have noticed? Who's with him?
Those who are with him are called chosen and faithful.
Okay, and it said in Zechariah 14:5 that all the holy ones are with him. Here are those called chosen and faithful. Any guesses before you get to 19 on who those people are?
Us.
Us, if you were in heaven with him, the church, yes, coming back with him. Then in 19, Revelation 19, we have this amazing picture again, verses 11 to 21, when heaven opens and you see who comes out. What kind of details did you grab hold of from Revelation 19?
He comes out on a white horse.
Okay,
Faithful and true, and in righteousness he judges and wages war.
okay, good. Key ideas there for us to be able to figure out who this is. They're going to go into more details. Okay, who else wants to talk to us tonight? You're gonna force me to call on people here in a minute.
His eyes flame of fire.
Okay,
On his head, many crowns. He
okay,
has a name. He has a name written on him, which no one knows but himself.
okay. That's
He is
good.
clothed. He's clothed with a robe dipped in blood. His name is called Word of God. From his
Okay.
mouth a sharp sword, so that with it he may strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron.
Yeah,
The beast and kings of earth make war against him who sat on the horse.
okay, good. What's the result of this battle?
The beast was seized and the false prophets were thrown into the fiery lake.
Okay. What happens to the people left on the earth? What happens to their bodies before they end up in the same place?
The rest were killed with a sword from his mouth.
Okay.
Birds gorged themselves.
Yes, the birds gorge themselves. That was a very diplomatic way to say that, Deanna. We've had some interesting discussions about this passage. That was very lovely. Thank you. That was probably about as nicely as you could put that. So, are there details here that make you feel like you can connect that battle, this time frame in Revelation 19, back to the prophecies in Zechariah 12 to 14? You got some details, right? This battle, the king's gathering, if you put together all these verses from 16 to 19. So we are able to see in that day, this battle of the Lord coming himself to do the battle. Other thoughts or questions about that part?
Well, we didn't really, well, I guess that's in verse 6.
Oh, you ready to go on?
Well, not necessarily. I was just thinking on.
Okay, that's good. We're getting ready. Okay. So speaking of that, Janelle, we're going to take these. Let's see. Why don't you just read verses 6 and 7 for us? We'll take those, I guess. Actually, why don't you read 6 to 11 and then we'll break them down smaller.
Okay. In that day, there will be no light. The luminaries will dwindle. For it will be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night. But it will come about that at evening time there will be light. And in that day, living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as in winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day, the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one. All the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate, as far as the place of the first gate to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. People will live in it, and there will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security.
Okay, good. Some of the things after a while, they start to sound like promises that have been made all the way through Zechariah, right? Every, we have these warnings about things and then we have promises and we have these promises and we start to see when God's going to pull some of this stuff together. So if we look back, we read 6 to 11, but really verses 6 and 7 were their own little segment. What is the focus of verses 6 to 7?
That it's a unique day. There will be no light.
Okay.
Then in the evening, there will be light.
Okay.
It will be kind of reversed.
Okay. So we see a change in God's light, right? And how he has ordered the light to work. He's changed that. What about verse 8?
Well, we have the living waters talked about again, that they flow out of Jerusalem to the east and to the west.
Okay. And
And
then
they keep flowing all year round, summer
They-
and winter.
flowing
all
all
the time.
year round, right? So this day, when it says it's a unique day, we know that everything that gives off light will do that in a different way than it did before. Flowing waters will change, and the seasons will operate differently. So when also, then what else could you say? If waters change how they flow, what else is changing then? Anybody, good science person, know what it is that causes waters to flow the way that they flow?
Geography.
It says at the moon because of the tide.
Tides, which indicates moon, and gravity, right? Is it gravity, the
Mhm.
gravitational pull, and the moon, everything. So when we think unique day, and how did God introduce himself? I think in chapter 12 or just a couple chapters ago, what were we supposed to make sure that we knew about him?
Who's the
Chapter 12.
creator?
He's the creator who has control over all these things. And so this unique day we could see as a day that he is making an indicator. Is this going to get people's attention on that day when these kinds of things happen?
Yeah.
Anybody besides me?
You would hope
kind of-
so, but you
Yeah.
never know.
Anybody besides me praying for some amazing supernatural things to start happening? Like,
Oh.
I know they're going to. I'm just waiting. I'm just praying for them. Okay. In fact, he indicates this for us in verse 9. What does he tell us? What do we learn in verse 9? If this is a great key verse.
He will be king over all the earth.
Yeah. Would you
The
call him?
only, the only one.
Oh, the only one. Okay. And his name will be the
name.
only one.
one.
So would you say that that is different than how we would think of him reigning today? Dee Dee, you're nodding. So why do you say it's different?
Because Satan reigns on the earth right now. So
Okay.
even though God really reigns over everything on the earth, Satan is in control right now. So yeah,
That's
because
so
it says he will be the king over all the earth. And so I guess it's semantics when you look at it, but he several times, they say Satan rules, rules here now, even though God rules over him.
yes. Yes. And this is a group of people, if you're watching us, that you may not know that, but the scriptures are clear on that. In fact, Satan had the authority to offer Jesus the world in the desert. And Jesus never told him, you don't have the authority to do that. He just said, no, I'm going to follow my Father. So if you know this role, we know he's been given authority. Even beyond that, in a way, though, we know he was the victor, and everybody knows that. And so I asked the question because we need to know that this is going to be a different thing, right? Are there people on the earth right now who, even if we were to say, well, Jesus is my king, he reigns here, would people argue with us? Would there be people who argued that fact?
Sure.
Yes. Is that different than the day that's coming? Yes, because there won't be any arguing, or you wouldn't be alive to answer the question, right? To ask the question. That's the picture that we're getting. And then we're going to go in to 1,000-year literal millennial reign of Jesus on the earth, which he is not doing right now. So it's important that you know how to put all these scriptures together, because it will help you stand up to some of the other teachings that are being put out there. And I need to look this up sometime. There is an amazing teaching that I saw on the millennial kingdom that lays out the importance of the belief in a literal millennial kingdom because of all the things that are left in the Bible that haven't happened yet and actually are going to happen in that time frame. So for people that are amillennialists and have taken away that literal reign, it would leave a whole host of things undone that have to be done during that time frame. So it's a great teaching. I'll find that and send it to you guys at some point if you want to watch it. For those of you who did Kinsman Redeemer, part of it is that picture. We just said Satan's in control of this earth. Jesus is coming back to avenge that land, to take it back, and to take back the people. Those are going to happen. Literally, he's going to take back that land in the millennial kingdom. Okay, so that's a side note, but it always reminds me when we get here that this reign is different than what we have now. He reigns in our hearts. He is the king. God is ruler over the world, but God has allowed this until he takes him captive and gets rid of him forever. Okay, verses 10 and 11 then talk to us back about Jerusalem. What do we learn about that?
All the land's going to be a plain, and Jerusalem is going to rise up. And it says the gates. I'm guessing it's a border around Jerusalem. It tells us which of the gates from the gates, just to describe how big, and it's going to raise up above everything else.
And because of that, or in addition to it,
the people will live in there, and it's no longer going to be a curse. And I'm assuming that's the curse on the people that are against it, because maybe it won't have any more enemies.
okay. So Jerusalem will dwell in security. Okay. So if you've got a segment for verses 10 and 11, they pretty much gave it to you there. So here's this picture, right? You can do this in your margin, right? You've got verses 1 through 5, a battle that the Lord's going to come and fight the nations that fight Jerusalem. He's bringing his holy ones with him. Like, these are things you can list even before or until you know what they mean, right? You can still make a list. Then in that day, we see that everything is going to change in the way that God has ordered his world. He's going to make it obvious that it's different. He is going to reign, and he will be the only king. His name will be the only one. There won't be anybody else in charge. And Jerusalem will finally reach that point that God's been talking to us about through Zechariah and through scripture, that Jerusalem will dwell in security. So those are, if that kind of order helps you, it frequently helps me. Okay. Any questions about verses 1 through 11 before we move into the next segment, which is 12 to 15? Okay, so I need somebody to read these verses. Laura, can you read them? Verses 12 to 15?
Sure. Now this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth. It will come about in that day that a great panic from the Lord will fall on them, and they will seize one another's hand, and the hand of the one will be lifted up against the hand of the other. Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver and garments in great abundance. So also, like this plague, will be the plague on the horse, the mule, the camel, the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in those camps.
Okay, so we have another picture of what happens on this day, and who is it going to happen to specifically?
The people.
Those
Yeah.
who've gone against Jerusalem.
Yeah, so here's more word towards those nations that come against Jerusalem. This time, instead of battle, what's it going to be? Plague. So this time, as you heard it or you read it yourself, you heard that word repeatedly. It describes the plague in verse 12. What will that be like? There's
Their
one
flesh
word.
will rot while they
Rot.
stand on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth.
Okay, so that's a lot of rot, right? That's not a pretty picture. That's a plague. And it gives us the time frame again. Yeah, this is the verse I was thinking of earlier when I was thinking about chapter 12 and the description of the riders being seized with madness. What also is part of this plague, or what happens because of it?
They'll fight
Okay.
against,
A lot of infighting.
Yeah, Cheryl?
I just said they'll fight against each other.
They'll fight against each other. It says they'll be seized with what?
One another's hand.
Oh, right, I used the wrong word. They'll have a great panic, right? They'll feel panic and literally end up fighting each other. You know, when something works really well for God, he likes to use it over and over again, apparently. If you've read the scriptures, this is not a new tactic of God's. He's done this in other battles as well. I wouldn't be surprised if it was maybe, no, it might not have been the same place. But anyway, they're going to end up in battle with each other. So think of that cup of reeling. That's what it sounds like, right? Like we're still talking about that same idea. That's part of what the battle will be like. What else do you know about this plague?
It'll strike the animals too, the beasts of burden.
Okay, so all of the animals listed there will be part of the plague. And then what's the good news? Like the good news for Judah and Jerusalem, obviously their enemies being killed, but what else happens?
They will gather the wealth of all the surrounding nations, their gold,
Okay.
silver, garments in great abundance.
Okay, so when you're reading verses 12 to 15 and you see the word plague repeated and you see Jerusalem coming away with great wealth, does anybody get reminded of anything else? Any other time something similar happened?
The Exodus out of Egypt.
The Exodus out of Egypt, the plagues against Pharaoh. I just find that interesting considering who we're going to read about in a couple verses, right? So this is a similar thing when we read about plagues. We also know, even according to the Revelation verses that we just had, that these are called plagues, these last things that happen to the world in those chapters in Revelation. Other thoughts or questions about this segment?
I'm always puzzled by the animals. Why do the animals have to suffer? Like some places in the Old Testament, they hamstring the horses,
Yeah.
and here they suffer the plague.
Yeah.
And I never quite grasped that understanding.
Yeah.
I mean, it takes away their modes of transportation.
Yeah, in a practical way that would happen. Any other reason you could see?
No.
No, anybody.
That's
Who's
their
talking?
wealth, right?
I'm sorry,
That's their-
Tracy.
That's their wealth. I mean, that's part of their wealth is
Part of
their
the wealth.
possessions
Yeah.
of their livestock.
But he could have given it to Israel instead.
Yeah.
Instead of killing it, then he could have given it to them.
Yeah.
This is a supernatural day, right? We just looked at the fact that light's going to change, rivers are going to flow, seasons are going to change. Making a plague against the men and the men fighting is one thing. What happens when people watching or people involved see the same plague impacting their animals? This is just my thought. Does it completely indicate that this is from the Lord?
Oh, of course.
Of course, just because it's one thing generally when a bunch of human beings all have the same plague or the same madness. It might be another thing altogether when all of their animals would have it as well. And as we know, is this same plague happening to anybody or probably any animals that belong to Judah or Jerusalem? No. Again, and that makes it very similar to parts of the plagues against Pharaoh and his people,
Yeah.
when, especially with the animals, there was a time when a plague impacted Pharaoh's and people's animals, but not
All the
those of
firstborn.
Israel
Mhm.
and all the firstborn. And there was a time with the cattle as well in one of those plagues, I believe, did not impact those of Israel. So that's my very non commentatory kind of answer. That's just me looking at what I think God's trying to indicate here. Anybody have other thoughts on it or look it up or anything? Yeah. Nope. Okay, well, let's go on to 16 to 19. Pat, can you read those verses for us?
Are we in 14?
Yes,
I had
14.
just sitting back looking for something. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's okay. Verses 16 to 19.
Okay. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths.
Okay. So this chapter was one of the things that really opened my eyes to some of the things that we were looking at in Revelation and how I thought I had kind of had everything pictured. Then I had to repicture things because of this passage and even some of the passages in Revelation. So we're still talking about, and then we've got then, right? Then it will come about. So we have a battle. We have the Lord coming. He's going to be king. There are going to be plagues. People will fight each other as part of the battle. Does this look like a fun day? Maybe if you're Israel and you're getting to watch and cheer from the sidelines, but not if you're going to have any of this happen to you. It says, then it will come about. Who is the group of people called here? That was really bad grammar, but
Those who are left.
any who are
The
left of
family.
all the nations. So what do we get to not assume? What can we infer from here? Do some people survive the battle part of the day of the Lord?
Mhm.
Yes, they do. Now, that means they gave in, they said they believe, whatever would have had to happen, they stopped, right? Or maybe they weren't battling Jerusalem at all. Maybe there were nations there who weren't. But we know that there are some people left. And we know that as you study Revelation as well. Okay, so they have made it through. Now, what are they to do?
Celebrate the Feast.
We're going to worship the King,
At what time frame?
Feast of Booths.
The Feast of Booths, which is something you've probably talked about with us because there have been many books or times when we've gone and looked at these feasts, and we'll talk more about those details in a minute. So they're all called to do that. Then what else do we learn about that situation?
They don't go, they won't get any rain.
Okay, which is a sign of what always in the Old Testament?
Famine.
famine is the result, but what's it a sign of if God says you don't get any rain?
God's curse.
Curse, judgment, right? You're still going to receive judgment. So these nations left, there's an if here, right? So apparently they have the choice, but they're supposed to go worship the king, the Lord of hosts. And then there's a specific nation that's focused on as well.
Egypt.
Egypt.
If the family of Egypt. So look at the history of Egypt in the Bible. And if you don't remember, we don't have time to go there, but one of the things that I was reminded of was that passage in Isaiah near the end. It's Isaiah 19 or 20, one of those two chapters about Assyria and Egypt, and there's going to be a highway and they're going to go. And I was just blown away by these two common enemies throughout scripture of Israel, God letting them survive. So we know that there are some, but they're focused on specifically. So even you, Egypt, if you don't go do this, you will have the same thing. And then even more clearly than just not having the rain, what else does he say?
Plague.
A plague, and he will
Smite the nations.
smite them. And this will be the punishment if they don't go. So, oh, I knew we were going to still run out of time. You had some references on the Feast of Booths. Does someone want to, you had Leviticus 23. Tell us what we know about the Feast of Booths from looking at it in Leviticus.
I think it's on the 15th, the 7th month, and then it's celebration for 7 days to the Lord.
Good. The 15th day of the 7th month, a 7-day celebration to the Lord. Why is it called the Feast of Booths? What was the actual, what did they do during this 7 days?
They lived in booths as a reminder of when they lived in the wilderness in tents.
At what time frame?
When they were brought out from the land of Egypt.
When they were brought out from the land of Egypt. So I wish that we, I mean, this whole focus again on the idea, these sounding like the plagues from that time, and then him calling out Egypt specifically, and then this particular festival has to be the Feast of Booths, which celebrated their coming home from Egypt. What do you think God might be saying here with this focus on this particular feast?
I think
Maybe
it's,
represent the coming home to heaven.
Okay, say it again, Janelle.
Perhaps it represents the fact that we'll be coming home to security, to a heavenly place.
Okay,
I mean,
good.
it doesn't really say heaven, but
Yeah.
we're heading there.
We are, yeah. So even to these guys, even to people at other times when he's talked about it, or right now, again, what was the reminder to them? By what were they supposed to remember every year when they celebrated Feast of Booths?
that I am the God that brought you out of Egypt.
I am the God who brought you out of a place where you were exiles and you were captives, and I have brought you home and made you free. But the picture of that is not living in the comfort of the house you live in, but is going to a temporary, separate little booth made out of foliage. What does that add to the picture? What's the focus? Couldn't he have done that with them living in their homes, but had them, they're already celebrating Passover to do that also, that very same remembrance, right? So why the focus? Why do they have to move out of their houses and live in these little booths made out of foliage to remember this?
Well, I was going to go with the different of Paul saying our bodies are our temporary tents and we were going to be leaving them.
Okay.
That just popped into my head. So when you were talking about temporary
Okay.
tents.
Okay. Tracy, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say as a reminder that he provided for them when they were in the wilderness. Basically,
Okay.
had nothing. No
Okay. Okay, good. Well, we'll talk about it at the end. We'll think about it a bit more. You had, just as something else to add some detail, you had a reference in the New Testament from John 7 about Jesus. What were you reminded of about this same time frame that had to do with Jesus?
On the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood at the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water."
Okay, good. So we, again, just see the importance of this feast of Jesus. And this was early on. Remember, I'm always reminded in John when we studied it, and here again, John 7, and already he's walking in Galilee because the Jews were seeking to kill him. And you'd have to look back at 6 and the events there to
Yeah.
see what had happened and why. But already, and tying in the living water, which we don't have time to talk about it, but if you go back and look at your cross-reference of Ezekiel 47, that was in this chapter, that had to do with the splitting of the Mount of Olives, but also the flowing of living waters and the flowing of Jerusalem. That would be an interesting way to tie it in, instead of just about the flowing waters, but here as well. There was that passage about the waters and where they were going to flow, and Jesus giving out the Spirit. If you look at that back chart that you had on the last 2 pages, some of you have seen this chart many times about the feasts of Israel and the spring ones, which have all already prophetically been fulfilled by Jesus. That's what you would notice when you look at those 2 pages. The second set are all in 1 month, which is what?
The month of Tishri.
Yeah, what's the number?
7.
7th
7th.
month.
So that's the month we're in. So where in the order of all these feasts of Israel does the Feast of Booths come?
Last.
Last. It's the last thing to happen. And if you look prophetically, you see that they've given you where these all relate to in terms of Jesus's coming or second coming. What do they tie that into? What is the prophetic indication of the Feast of Booths? It's on the bottom of the chart.
Families of the earth will come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Booths.
Okay, so this is pictured as a literal thing that will happen, right? We see it in the scriptures, and it lines up with the prophetic indication of that time frame of the things that are going to happen. That's a great chart for looking at that second segment of the things that are left yet to be fulfilled, and help you to tie them into time frames. So we pretty much had it sort of ignored in the homework, but we do have 2 final verses. What's your takeaway from verses 20 and 21? In 2 verses, again, we're told in that day. What's the focus of what it's going to be like in that day, according to those 2 passages?
Everything will be holy to the Lord.
Everything will be holy to the Lord. Yeah, that's it. That's the point of what he's saying. And again, we can see then a difference between the world that we live in now and this world that's coming. Other thoughts or questions before we talk about a little bit of insight and wrap up? Or you can go right to your application or thoughts, any of those things. Thoughts, questions, what are you walking away from Zechariah with?
I think the conversion that happens between verse 16 to 21, it's emphasized over and over again, and so that gives me hope.
Yes.
I wrote down, take courage. be a source of living water. Repent. God makes a plain out of the mountains in our lives.
Very nice. Thank you, Janelle. Yes.
And here people still have a choice to do
Yeah.
God's will or not to do God's will.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts? They asked you to think of your application this time in terms of, do you have something you want the Lord to do for you? You could share that if you want. Or did you have any impacts or thoughts about where we live, what's happening in our time compared to what we looked at in Zechariah? Again, I know a lot of people would think, oh, well, what are you going to get to talk about for application if you talk about a book like Zechariah? If only they knew the little they don't really think about. But does anybody just have any kinds of closing or wrap up thoughts or memories of other, has it been something we talked about earlier? Just what were your final takeaways? I know it's hard to think that normally we'd have one more class to even talk about as wrap up, but
There's so much infighting going on in this world today. I wonder if that's the, and then different plagues and illnesses and things that pop up, and every time this happens, you think, well, is this it?
yeah, there are a lot of things going on, and yeah, that picture is definitely similar.
When I keep of going through trials and the fire, because America, we don't even know what it's like compared to what people go through in third world and other countries. But it gives me hope.
Yes.
It's going to be hard, but
yes,
we know him.
yes, yes.
Well, I think it always keeps coming back to God's going to save his people. I mean, God's going to do it. Again, we just have to trust him, and he is going to do it. They'll be there, but the Lord is the one that fights the battle, and the Lord's the one that's going to win.
Yes. So that's a great reminder on days when you wonder what all we're going to see, how much we have to go through. And to Dee Dee's point, sometime if you're reading Psalms, or if you want to go look through Psalms, there are several verses where God, in fact, says that he either hides his people when evil rises, or his people will hide themselves when evil rises. And so in many times there, I have sort of like, well, how do we hide ourselves? But he says he will, as Dee Dee says, he says that there's a protection for his people. And so if it's not immediately out of this world, then it'll be through what we're going through. And that is hopeful. And we can remember when we look at books like Zechariah, who he is and who he says he is. And so that verse about him being king, and he will be recognized as king, that he already is, and we can say that that day is coming. Interestingly for me, it's interesting, there's always things all the way through, but when we got to this section on the Feast of Booths, and I was doing some cross-referencing, one of the other places where there's a really interesting focus on the Feast of Booths is in Nehemiah. So we're in Zechariah, where remnants come back to rebuild the temple. But as we know, when we get to Nehemiah, then another remnant, some exiles, come back to build the walls of the city. And so in chapter 8, they reach this point where they find, or they dig up, or they get out the scrolls, they get out the book of the law, and Ezra reads it to the people. And he reads and reads and reads, and then they weep because they realize all the things they haven't done or they haven't kept because they have forgotten them. It just so happens that this falls on the date that's the beginning of the Feast of Booths. And so the first thing that they celebrate is the Feast of Booths. And they, Ezra and Nehemiah say, don't weep, rejoice, go get, and let's do the things we're supposed to do to celebrate this feast. And it just really struck me that this other group of exiles that came back, this is the time that God brought them back. And it said that they had not celebrated Feast of Booths since Joshua. Think how long, because of all their captivity and things that had happened, that they didn't do that. And so when I thought about this question, I was sort of asking all of you about why the booths and why the Feast of Booths, why they just got back there. Maybe, of course, maybe this group didn't even really have homes. I don't think some of them did, but they had to go gather these things to live in and temporarily. And I just thought, as somebody said, you know, there's a group of exiles. And when we did First Peter, you know, that was my focus. That was our focus from the beginning of being pilgrims or being exiles, and that we would look at ourselves as that's our role here on earth. It isn't our home. So when I kind of was thinking about it, like that's sort of the picture to me, is that God is the one who's going to take us home. And we're supposed to be reminded that this earth is not our comfortable home. He really is calling us. We should look at our homes as booths. We should look at them as temporary dwellings like tents, as somebody mentioned, because we're going to go. He's going to remove us from the exile that we are here and take us all the way back where our true comfort and rest is really going to be. And I just felt maybe for them, it's the same reminder that we need, that that house that we build is not the home he's calling us to, and neither is this world. So that was my tie-in all the way back to First Peter from more than a year ago. So that is it. Unless somebody's got some other thoughts or comments that have popped up, we will be preparing for Malachi, which, as you've probably already figured out, follows Zechariah. So I will say, anybody watching or any of you here, if you didn't get good full time with Zechariah, especially the end, that would be something else you could do to prepare over our break. You could make sure that you've got a good handle on Zechariah 12 to 14, because it's going to provide the next step for Malachi as well. But again, you can read and read and read Malachi. It's so good and so easy to read and so quick to read. So, okay. Any other thoughts or questions before we pray? We're a little late, so. All right, let me end the video and watch for information on Malachi. I will be putting out a short video or a post about how to gather and do everything that you need to do if you're somebody who's just watching us online. All right, thank you, and Merry Christmas to everyone.